Hello friends, this is Prasad Patki from SIMMI Foundation. In today's session, we are going to learn parallel forms of education. After completion of this session, you will be able to understand the different forms of education and their importance. While trying to understand what constitutes the meaning or concept of education, you must have noticed that the concept of education has been perceived differently by different scholars. Similarly, education has been characterized differently by different viewpoints. One such characterization about the concept of education is that education is a social action or a social process. It operates in various social spaces. One may ascribe to this operation as the human socialization. In this sense, education is a socialization process. As you know, human learning mostly takes place in a learning environment. Although some kind of human learning taking place during infancy are linked to biological impulses. Hence, education of a child in a broader sense starts from the family, which is the first social environment for the child. From the natural learning environment like the family, a child moves to a contrived social environment like the school. Here, the child spends a substantial time of its formative period. Once the child is out of contrived social environment and enters the world of work, as an adult continues to educate himself through many semi-contrived learning environments. Based on these three different kinds of learning environments, educationists have broadly classified education into three forms of education, namely informal, formal, and non-formal. Let us discuss these three forms of education in a greater detail. Informal education. Informal education takes place in any kind of informal learning environment. There is no formality attached to such education. This form of education is the most primitive form of education and the most broad-based in its nature and scope. As we know that for a child, the first social environment for informal education is the family or home. The child learns a lot of life skills, attitudes, social manners, and knowledge of his immediate world through its interaction with family members like mother, father, brothers, sisters, and others. In this way, the family becomes a launching pad for a child's future education. Apart from family, neighborhood and peer group are also agencies of informal education for a child. Apart from family, neighborhood, and peer groups, a child learns from a variety of informal agencies which provide learning experiences in informal environments. Agencies like television, radio, films, newspapers, magazines, books of readings, etc. do help in the process of socialization of a child. But learning experiences are not purposefully designed. However, when a child interacts with such agencies, he or she acquires a lot of learning experiences which are educative. A child also gets a number of learning experiences through interaction with different kinds of environmental situations he encounters every day. A child who has cut his finger with a blade knows that he should use the blade carefully. Such experiences are not consciously provided by any informal agency but acquired by the child through his interaction in the environment. This is also a kind of informal education, although more appropriately called incidental learning or education. Many learning experiences gathered from interaction with the environment may be undesirable, hence they cannot be recognized as educational. For example, a child is taking to smoking under peer pressure may not be considered as an educational experience. Based on what we have studied so far, we may characterize informal education as follows. Informal education is the outcome of the interaction between the learner with his or her social environment. Informal education is neither organized nor structured. Only desirable learning can be called informal education. Informal education is purposeful but many times incidental. Informal education can take place in a variety of physical and social settings. There is no regular or prescribed form. Informal education is experiential in nature. This means the learner learns a lot through interacting with the learning environment. Informal education is a lifelong process which starts at the time of birth and continues till the death of a human being. Inadequacy of informal education in catering to the transmission of the ever-growing body of knowledge to the future members of the society gave rise to formal education. Hence, the primary objective of formal education is to transmit the knowledge, skills, attitudes, beliefs, etc. preserved and propagated by a society. In order that transmission of societal knowledge takes place, education must be formalized and coordinated by an agency like the state, keeping in focus the broad societal aims. Hence, it is the responsibility of the state to carry out this function through its designated agencies like school, college, or university. Learning experiences provided through formal education are vertically and horizontally structured. Vertically means formal education starts from primary school to secondary education and university education. And horizontally means to run through general academic studies, technical, vocational, and professional studies. Let us discuss various aspects of formal education. Goals. Goals of formal education are explicit. They are generally deduced from the broad societal or national goals and are formulated in such a way that they are achieved in the long-term perspective. However, in order to achieve the goals, short-term objectives are formulated and pursued in the educational operation. Timing. Unlike informal education, formal education follows a rigid and fixed time schedule. Learning time is defined and structured according to the prescribed guidelines set by the school or the state. Curricular experiences. Content and duration of a program or a course is decided by the state or the educational institution. Curriculum is created based on the broad social or national needs as well as individual needs. Even the transaction of curricular experiences is geared towards the achievement of long-term societal goals. Entry requirements. Educational institutions or the state determines entry requirements to formal education. Hence, to acquire a certain kind of learning experience, one has to fulfill the entry requirements. For example, one cannot take admission in a college unless he or she completes school education. Delivery system. Delivery of learning experiences is rigidly structured, teacher-centered, and resource-intensive. Transaction of learning experiences mostly takes place within the institution, isolated from the environment. All this does not mean undermining of the learner, but the degree of control in the delivery system rests more with the teacher and the institution than with the learner. Operational control. The operation of formal education is controlled by a hierarchical administrative academic structure wherein a number of functionaries like the principal, vice principal, and teacher operate in a hierarchical order. Assessment of learning objectives. Unlike informal education, specific procedures or mechanisms are followed to assess the achievement of learning objectives in formal education. These mechanisms are student assessment through conduct of tests and examinations. Although formal education has become an inevitable part of what constitutes the education for a human being, it also suffers from inadequacies to meet the growing demand for education. Therefore, non-formal education emerged out of the inadequacies of formal education to meet the ever-increasing demand for education. Non-formal education, like formal education, is an organized activity which takes place outside the formal educational structure. It also intends to achieve predetermined educational objectives. But unlike formal education, non-formal education always caters to the learning needs of a specific target group. In India, adult education programs, basic education programs, literacy programs, health awareness programs, programs meant for school dropouts, agricultural extension programs, and the like constitute in non-formal education programs. Let us discuss certain aspects of non-formal education. Goals and objectives. Non-formal education programs are always conceptualized to achieve short-term and special educational goals and objectives. For example, in any kind of literacy program, the objective is only to achieve literacy among the illiterates, and the program is geared towards the achievement of that objective only. Timing. Non-formal education programs are generally run for a short period on a part-time and recurrent basis. For example, agricultural extension programs are short-term programs but are provided again and again to the farmers. Curricular experiences. Curricular experiences are generally formulated keeping in mind the specific needs of the target group. These are more individualized rather than broad-based and general in nature. For example, programs meant for village-level health workers contain specific information pertaining to health care in the context of village environment. Teaching learning process. The teaching learning process is generally learner-oriented and flexible in nature. Transaction of learning experiences is centered around community resources. Administrative mechanism. It is self-governing and democratic in nature. Activities in non-formal education programs are mostly organized, keeping in mind the convenience of the organizers as well as the learners. Assessment of learning objectives. Like formal education, measures are also taken to carry out both formative and summative assessment by midterm review and final review. That's all from this session. We'll meet you again in next session soon. Thank you.